In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The third chapter of The Joy of the Gospel is about proclaiming the gospel. And Francis, as you can imagine, says that every one of us who is a missionary disciple has the responsibility to proclaim the gospel. Every single one of us. And we don't need that much training. We don't need years and years of training to proclaim the gospel. He speaks about it on the level of person to person. We speak to one another about the faith that is in us. From the pulpit, about evangelizing new cultures. I want to just share a number of persons who over the years influenced me and made me think about the Word and the proclaiming of the Word. I remember when I was a Jesuit novice, I read a book by, he was Metropolitan Anthony. He was an Orthodox bishop in exile. And one little thing stuck out for me, and it was, as a teenager, he had gone through a very secular phase and had decided that he was going to give up the religion of his youth. And the night that he was going to do it, he decided, I will read the gospel one last time as a kind of farewell gesture. He said he opened the gospel, he saw that the Gospel of Mark is the shortest, so he said, I'll read that one. And he started the beginning of Mark's gospel and he read. And he says, after a couple of chapters, he realized that he was not alone, that there was someone with him. He realized that he had encountered Jesus, the Word of God. Now, you may or may not have had such an experience, but every one of us is encouraged to believe that in faith, when we read the Word of God, we do encounter Jesus, the Word of God, who changes our lives. And when we have that experience, we have something to proclaim, to share with others. A few years later, I had moved on from the novitiate. I was now a Jesuit student studying in the university in Dublin. And I remember the influence now was two persons. One was Chiara Lubich, the founder of the Focolare movement, whom I met through a little group in UCD. I was struggling with my studies. They weren't going particularly well, and it seemed like as if getting through the next essay or not getting through it, as the case might be, was the big thing. How was I going to do? Was I going to do well? Was I going to do badly? And I met this little group who had been influenced by Chiara Lubich. And I'll start with, they told me about Chiara. She, during the Second World War, was a young woman, I think in her early 20s, and she had gathered round her a group of teenage girls. They were a sodality group. And the war came. They were in Trent, and the Allies were bombing Trent. So bombs were falling on their city every night, and they used to have to race off to the air raid shelters. And in the air raid shelters, this little group of girls were facing death, possible death, every time, every day. And they said to one another, if we were to die tomorrow or the next day, what would we want to have done with these days? And they had the scriptures, and they said, we would want to have listened to what was in the Bible. They opened it and words just began to jump out at them. One, of course, was, love one another as I have loved you. So they said, we will do that. Let's start and do that now. And something absolutely transformative happened. This little group of half a dozen young girls saw that there were people losing their houses, there were people whose houses were blown up who had lost their relatives, there were people starving on the streets, and they began to organize themselves and to organize others. And they became the center. Within about a week, there were 500 people who were on fire with the gospel. They had discovered that when they read the gospel, there was a new force at work in them. And it was a very simple thing of simply living the gospel. And I saw that at work among my fellow students in UCD. They invited me to come to a meeting every week, and we would meet over lunchtime. And we sat, and somebody would say, "How did you live the gospel last week?" And we would hear different stories of what people were doing. One sticks out with me. There was a girl called, her name was Ita. Ita one day said, "I was coming into college this morning and I was late. And I knew I was going to be late for my class, and I was running. And on the way, I saw a little girl on the side of the street, and she was in floods of tears. I asked her what was wrong. And she told me her mummy had sent her out to buy a bottle of milk. She had bought it, and on her way out of the shop, it fell and smashed. Glass bottles, you remember. And she was devastated because she had no more money. Ida said, I was going to give her the money for the bottle and race on because I was late. But I said I wouldn't. I went with the little girl into the shop, bought the milk for her, bought her a bar of chocolate, and sent her away, and she was so happy. And I was so happy, Ida said. And these young people and Chiara Lubich taught me that that was more important than the essay that I might write or not write, or the degree that I might get or not get. It was the gospel, and the gospel was something to be lived and, as I saw Ida doing with me, to be shared. Then, that was Chiara Lubich and Ida and others like her. Something totally different. An Italian Jesuit from the 16th century called Matteo Ricci influenced me, and he comes to my mind. The Jesuits were always intent on bringing the gospel to China, and that was extremely difficult. And eventually Ricci and some others went to China in the early 1600s. Ricci was very well prepared. He had trained very well in Italy. He had good philosophy and theology. He had also studied mathematics and science and astronomy, and he was a bright fellow. He went to China and learned Chinese and began to talk to the Chinese about mathematics and astronomy. And even though the Chinese intellectuals were very smart, there were some things that the Westerners knew that impressed them. But Ricci went one stage further. He not only learned Chinese, he learned Chinese philosophy, he learned Confucianism. He learned it so well that he was able to converse as an equal with the Chinese. Consequently, he was the first Westerner, the first non-Chinese ever to enter the Forbidden City in Beijing. And he began to dialogue with the Chinese. And he spoke to them about our God, the God of Jesus Christ, in their terms, in their categories. It was truly revolutionary. It actually, at that time in history, it caused some upset. Some people wondered, is it possible to speak about God in these categories in which our God was never spoken of before? Ricci was convinced that it was. There were setbacks at that time, serious setbacks. But still, today, we recognize that this is one of the great challenges on that level, is for us to speak about Jesus and speak all the truths of the gospel in languages that people will understand. Ricci was able to do that because he was an extraordinarily bright guy in the China of the early 17th century. Francis would say, and before him Benedict and John Paul said too, Our challenge will be to speak the gospel in a language that the new cultures that we're experiencing, that we're running into today, throw at us. The modern world in many ways is a foreign country. How do we speak the gospel into the modern world in categories that the modern world will understand? Obviously, that does not mean that we speak about the gospel in categories that are inimical to or unacceptable to the gospel. But just as Matteo Ricci found in 17th century China that Christ can be spoken in language that the Chinese will understand, so too it is our challenge. We need bright young people who learn the language of the new worlds that lie out before us, and who have Jesus Christ in their hearts, and who speak about him eloquently and fluently in languages in which he has yet to be spoken of. This proclamation of the gospel can be done on so many levels. It was done by a 19-year-old Ida who shared the gospel and made it real for me all those years ago, because she told me about what she did with a little girl who was crying on the side of the street. It can be done by Matteo Ricci. It will be done by people at a very elevated level. It will only be done at any of those levels by people who in some way have had the experience that Anthony Bloom had in a very pronounced way. That is an experience of taking up the Word of God and reading it and making it a part of ourselves, letting us become a part of it. Because the Word of God is not, in the first place, a book. It is a person. It is a person that you and I can come to know. And when we come to know of him, we can live him and we can speak of him. But there is a big challenge. And my invitation to the people and the priests of my diocese is that we have to get to know him. And one central way of getting to know him is to read the book, to become familiar with the book, to love the book. And I think we can only do that when we come together of set purpose. There are people who can lead us. There are people who can teach us. We have to be ready. And that is my invitation. Because the word can only be proclaimed when the word is in our hearts. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us.